The Grand Conclave Station floated in the darkness between three dying stars. And Princess Lyrithis. Verkan stood at the viewing deck with her hands clasped behind her back as she watched the ships arrive one by one. Her scales shimmered with colors that shifted between deep purple and silver, catching the faint starlight that filtered through the massive windows. And her golden eyes reflected the distant galaxies like mirrors holding ancient secrets. 20 cycles had passed since the burning of Valoria Prime, and in those 20 cycles she had grown from a terrified child hiding beneath dead bodies into the ruler of 3-star systems and the commander of the mighty 7th fleet. She had rebuilt her empire from ashes and blood, and now she stood as one of the most powerful figures in the known galaxy. Yet there were nights when she still woke up screaming from dreams of fire and death. Today, the Galactic Council had summoned representatives from every major species to discuss a matter that many considered trivial and unimportant. And that matter was the integration of humanity into the coalition of civilized worlds. Lyrithis found the entire situation somewhat amusing because humans were barely spacefaring. Their civilization was young and small, and they had only discovered faster than light travel a mere 50 cycles ago. The Valorian sovereignty had ruled the stars for 10,000 cycles. The Mrethki collective had built empires before humans had learned to make fire. And the Valtorian Federation had conquered dozens of worlds while humans were still living in caves. What could these soft-skinned creatures possibly offer to the ancient powers of the galaxy? She wondered as she turned away from the window and prepared herself for the diplomatic ceremonies ahead. Her advisor, an elderly Valorian male named Kethronis, approached her with his tablet in hand and his expression showing the usual concern he always carried. "Your Highness," he said with a bow, "the human delegation has arrived at Docking Bay 7, and the Council requests your presence in the main chamber within the hour." Lyrithis nodded and adjusted the royal circlet that rested upon her head, the same circlet her mother had worn before the raiders had torn her apart in front of her own throne. "Tell me about these humans," she commanded as they began walking through the curved corridors of the station. "I have read the reports, but I wish to hear your assessment." Kethronis scrolled through his tablet and cleared his throat before speaking in his measured and careful way. "They are an unusual species, Your Highness, and the other delegations do not know what to make of them," he explained as they passed by groups of alien diplomats from a dozen different worlds. "Their lifespans are remarkably short, averaging only 80 cycles. Yet they accomplish more in those brief years than many species do in 500. He continued with a hint of confusion in his voice. "They are physically weak compared to most spacefaring races. They have no natural weapons like claws or venom, and their senses are quite limited," he added while shaking his head. "And yet," he said with a pause, "they have somehow survived and expanded despite all these disadvantages. And there are those who say they possess a quality that cannot be measured or understood." Lyrithis raised one scaled eyebrow and looked at her advisor with curiosity. "What quality is that?" she asked as they entered a lift that would take them to the main level of the station. Kethronis seemed to struggle for words, which was unusual for someone who had served the royal family for over 200 cycles. "The other species call it madness, Your Highness," he finally said, "but the humans call it hope." The lift doors opened and they stepped into the grand hallway that led to the council chamber, a vast space decorated with the symbols of every member species and filled with the sounds of dozens of alien languages. Lyrithis moved through the crowd with the grace that had been trained into her since birth, nodding to ambassadors and acknowledging the bows of lesser diplomats as she made her way toward the main entrance. She did not particularly want to be here because there were wars to plan and territories to defend and 1,000 other matters that demanded her attention. But the council had insisted, and she had obligations that could not be ignored. the chamber itself was enormous, with seats arranged in a circular pattern around a central platform where speakers would address the assembly. And the ceiling was made of transparent crystal that showed the endless stars. Above, representatives from the Mrethki collective sat in their water-filled pods, their tentacles waving slowly as they communicated in their strange silent language. And the Valtorians perched on elevated platforms with their great wings. Folded behind them, the Cathari collective had sent observers as well. And Lyrethis felt her scales darken with rage when she saw their chitinous forms clicking and chattering on the far side of the chamber. The Cathari were the ones who had burned her world, the ones who had slaughtered her family, the ones who had forced her to hide beneath the bodies of her dead handmaidens while she listened to her. People screamed she hated them with every fiber of her being. But politics demanded that she maintain diplomatic relations with the monsters who had destroyed everything she loved. Taking her seat in the Valorian section, Lyrithis forced her expression into the calm mask she had perfected over the years and waited for the ceremonies to begin. The council speaker, an ancient being of a species so old that no one remembered their true name, called the assembly to order and began the formal introductions. One by one, the delegations were announced, and one by one, they rose to acknowledge the assembly with whatever gesture their culture considered appropriate. And finally, the speaker announced in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, representing the United Earth government, Ambassador Jonathan Cole and his delegation. Lyrithis turned her head to observe these humans she had heard so much about, curious to see what such a young and insignificant species looked like in person. Human delegation entered through the main doors. A group of about 12 individuals wearing simple, dark uniforms that lacked the elaborate decorations favored by most spacefaring cultures. At the front walked a tall male with gray-streaked hair and a face marked by deep lines and old scars. And he moved with the confidence of someone who had seen much and feared. Little Lyrithis watched him approach the central platform and noticed that he walked with a slight limp, his left leg moving stiffly as if it had been badly injured long ago and never fully healed. Something about him seemed familiar in a way she could not explain, like a song she had heard in childhood but could not quite remember. He turned to face the assembly and raised his hand in greeting. And as he did so, his sleeve pulled back slightly to reveal his forearm. Lyrithis felt her breath catch in her throat and her heart began to pound with sudden violence. There on his arm, partially hidden by the fabric of his uniform, was an old burn scar twisted into a very specific shape, a shape she recognized instantly because she had been the one who made it when her claws had dug into his flesh as he carried her to flames and death 20 cycles ago. The chamber seemed to spin around her, and she gripped the arms of her chair so hard that her claws left marks in the ancient wood. It was impossible, absolutely impossible, because she had watched him die. She had seen him fall beneath the claws of 6 Cathari raiders. She had seen the fire consume the forest where he made his last stand. She had mourned him for 20 cycles, and yet here he was, standing in the council chamber, very much alive, the human who had saved her life when she was a child, the human who had carried her through hell and asked for nothing in return, the human whose name she had never learned. He was alive. Princess Lyrithis Vrakan, ruler of the Valorian sovereignty and one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, began to shake uncontrollably as tears she had not shed in decades began to fall from her golden eyes. 20 cycles earlier, the skies of Valoria Prime had burned orange and red as the Cathari raiders descended upon the peaceful world like a swarm of locusts hungry for destruction. Little Lyrithis was only 7 cycles old on that terrible night, and she had been sleeping in her royal chambers when the first explosions shook the palace walls and sent cracks running through the ancient stone. Her handmaidens had rushed into her room with terror in their eyes. their scales pale with fear as they grabbed the young princess and tried to find a way to escape the chaos that was consuming their world. The Cathari were everywhere, their chitinous bodies clicking through the corridors as they killed everyone they found, taking some as slaves and leaving others as corpses on the blood-soaked floors. Larethis had watched her father fall, his body torn apart by plasma fire as he tried to protect the throne room. And she had heard her mother screaming before the screams suddenly stopped. The handmaidens had carried her through secret passages and hidden tunnels, trying desperately to reach the emergency shuttles that were supposed to take the royal family to safety. But the Cathari had been waiting. They had ambushed the group in a narrow corridor, and Larethis had watched in horror as her protectors were cut down one by one, their bodies falling around her like leaves in a storm. The last handmaiden, a young female named Sylveth, who had been like an older sister to the princess, had pushed Larethis beneath a pile of bodies and whispered her final words. "Do not move, do not make a sound, and do not come out until you are certain they are gone," Sylveth had commanded before a Cathari blade had ended her life. So Larethis had hidden beneath the corpses of the women who had raised her, their blood soaking into her scales as she bit through her own lip to keep from screaming. Cathari had searched the bodies briefly, their clicking language filling the corridor with terrible sounds. But they had been in a hurry, and they had moved on without discovering the trembling child. Beneath the dead, for hours Larethis had remained there, too terrified to move, too shocked to cry. Listening to the sounds of her world dying around Hirsch, she had been certain that she would die there, alone in the darkness, surrounded by the bodies of everyone she had ever loved. And then she had heard footsteps. They were not the clicking steps of the Cathari, and they were not the soft padding of Valorian feet, but something different. Something strange. A creature appeared in the corridor, and little Larethis had never seen anything like it in all her life. It was tall and soft-skinned with no scales or fur or feathers, and it had flat teeth and forward-facing eyes and hair on its head that was the color of dark earth. The creature was wounded, with blood running down its face and burns covering its arms, and it carried nothing but a bent metal pipe that looked like it had been used as a weapon many times already. It was a human. Though Larethis did not know that word at the time, the human moved through the corridor with careful steps, checking the bodies one by one, and Larethis felt terror grip her heart, because she thought this creature might be another enemy. But then the human found her. He pushed aside the corpses and looked down at the little alien princess with eyes that showed no fear or disgust, only a deep and profound sadness. "Hey there, little one," he said in a language she did not understand, his voice soft and gentle. Despite the chaos around them, Larethis hissed and tried to scratch him, her small claws raking across his forearm and leaving deep marks that would become the scars she would recognize 20 cycles later. The human did not flinch or pull away. He simply waited until she had exhausted herself and then reached down with careful hands. "I know you are scared," he said as he lifted her from the pile of bodies and held her against his chest. "I know everything hurts right now, but I am going to get you out of here." She did not understand his words, but she understood his meaning. And for the first time since the attack began, she felt something other than terror. She felt hope. The human carried her through the burning palace, moving with a skill and determination that seemed impossible for someone so badly wounded. When Cathari patrols appeared, he would hide in shadows and alcoves, pressing the little princess against his chest and covering her mouth with gentle fingers to keep her silent. When there was no way to hide, he would fight, swinging his metal pipe with savage fury, striking down enemies twice his size with nothing but raw courage and desperate strength. Larethis watched him kill 3 Cathari raiders in a storage room, his movements fast and brutal, and she learned in that moment that this strange soft creature was the most dangerous being she had ever seen. They escaped the palace through a hole in the outer wall, where a missile had torn through the ancient stone. And the human carried her into the forest that surrounded the royal grounds. The forests were burning too, the fire spreading from the city into the wilderness, and the air was thick with smoke and the screams of the dying. For 3 days, the human traveled through the chaos, carrying the princess when she was too tired to walk and holding her hand when she could manage on her own. He gave her his water even when his lips cracked from thirst. He gave her his food even when his stomach growled with hunger. And he wrapped her in his jacket when the nights grew cold, even though he shivered beside her. He spoke to her constantly, always in that strange language she could not understand. But his voice was kind and calm, and it kept the nightmares at bay. On the second night, she had finally asked him the question that had been burning in her mind. Why? She had said in Valorian, pointing at herself and then at him, why help? The human had seemed to understand the question, even without knowing the words. He had pointed at his chest, at his heart, and then at her. And he had said something that she would later learn meant, because it is the right thing to do. On the third day, they were found at Cathari Patrol. 6 raiders armed with plasma rifles and hunting for survivors had spotted them near a river crossing. The human had looked at the approaching enemies and then looked at the little princess. And something in his eyes had changed. He had taken her hands in his and spoken urgently, pointing toward a distant ridge where the smoke was thinner and the fires had not yet spread. She had understood what he was telling her, and she had shaken her head violently because she did not want to leave him, but the human had been insistent, his voice firm even as the Cathari drew closer. And finally she had nodded through her tears, had pushed her toward the ridge, and turned to face the 6 armed raiders with nothing but his bent metal pipe. Run, he had said. The one word she understood. Run and do not look back. She had run, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could, her hearts pounding with fear and grief, but she had looked back. Just once, she had seen the human charge toward the Cathari with a battle cry that echoed through the burning forest, his pipe swinging wildly as he attacked enemies who outnumbered him and outgunned him completely. She had seen him fall beneath their claws, his body crumpling to the ground as they struck him again and again. She had seen the fire reach the clearing, the flames consuming everything. And then she had turned and continued running because that was what he had told her to do. The rescue ships from the Coalition had found her at dawn, a small alien child wandering alone through the ashes of her world. She had tried to tell them about the human, about the soft-skinned warrior who had saved her life, but no one had believed her. The Coalition had declared all non-Valorians on the planet dead, and the human's name had never been recorded in any database. He had been nobody, a random cargo pilot whose transport had been caught in the crossfire, a stranger who had died for a child he had never met. But to Princess Lyrithis Varkan, he had been everything. She had spent the next 20 cycles searching for any trace of him, commissioning statues and writing poems in his honor, never knowing his name but never forgetting his face. And now, standing in the council chamber of the Grand Conclave Station, she had found him at last. He was alive, and he was here. And everything she thought she knew about that terrible day was wrong. Ambassador Jonathan Cole had known this moment might come from the instant he had received his assignment to the Grand Conclave Station. He had spent 20 years trying to forget those 3 days on Valoria Prime, trying to bury the memories beneath layers of work and duty and the simple passage of time. But some memories refused to stay buried, and the image of that little alien girl with the golden eyes had haunted him through every night since his rescue from the Cathari prison camps. He remembered everything about those 3 days. Every moment burned into his mind with perfect and painful clarity. He remembered the terror he had felt when his cargo transport had been caught in the crossfire and sent spinning down toward the burning planet below. He remembered the crash, The way his ship had torn through the palace gardens and scattered debris across the royal grounds. The way he had pulled himself from the wreckage with broken ribs and bleeding wounds. He remembered the choice he had made in that moment. The choice that any sane person would call madness. He could have hidden, could have waited for rescue, could have done the sensible thing and stayed out of a war that was not his own, but then he had heard the screaming, the sounds of children crying and women begging and families being torn apart by monsters who felt no mercy or remorse in Jonathan Cole, a simple cargo pilot from a backwater planet called Earth, had picked up a metal pipe from the wreckage of his ship and walked into hell. He had not thought about politics or species or the vast gulf between humanity and the ancient civilizations of the galaxy. He had only thought about the screaming and about making it stop. The palace had been a nightmare of fire and death, and Jonathan had moved through it like a ghost, striking down Cathari raiders wherever he found them. He had not been a soldier, had never been trained for combat. But humans had a quality that the other species did not understand. When pushed to the edge, when facing impossible odds, humans did not calculate the chances of survival. They simply fought. He had found a little girl beneath a pile of bodies, her scales stained with blood that was not her own, her golden eyes wide with terror and shock. She had scratched him when he reached for her, her tiny claws raking deep furrows in his arm. But he had not blamed her, because fear made everyone dangerous. He had carried her out of the palace and into the burning forests, and for 3 days he had done everything in his power to keep her alive. It had been the hardest thing he had ever done, but also the most important when the Cathari patrol had found them near the river. Jonathan had known that his time had run out. He had looked at the little princess, at the child who had begun to trust him, and he had made another choice. He had told her to run. And then he had turned to face 6 armed raiders with nothing but his bent pipe and his stubborn human refusal to surrender. The fight had lasted only seconds. The Cathari had overwhelmed him easily, their claws tearing through his flesh, their weapons burning his skin. And he had fallen to the ground certain that he was about to die. But the Cathari had not killed him. They had recognized him as human, a rare species that fetched high prices in the slave markets. And they had dragged his broken body back to their ships instead of leaving him to burn for 18 months. Jonathan had suffered in a Cathari prison camp, enduring tortures that would have destroyed most beings, surviving only because he refused to give his captors the satisfaction of his death. Every night he had wondered about the little girl, praying to whatever gods might listen that she had made it to safety, that his sacrifice had meant something. When the coalition had finally liberated the camps, Jonathan had been more dead than alive, his body broken and scarred, his mind damaged by months of pain and isolation. But his first question upon waking in a hospital bed had been about Valeria. Had learned that the princess had survived, that she had been found by rescue ships and taken to safety, that she had become a symbol of her people's resilience. He had wept with joy at the news, tears streaming down his ruined face as relief washed over him like a wave. She was alive. The little girl with the golden eyes was alive, and everything he had suffered had been worth it in the years that followed. Jonathan had watched from afar as Lyrithis grew into a leader. He had read about her coronation, her military victories, a transformation of the Valorian sovereignty from a broken remnant into a powerful empire. He had felt proud of her, though he had no right to such feelings, and he had never tried to contact her or make his survival known. What claim did a human cargo pilot have on the gratitude of royalty? He had often asked himself. He had simply done what anyone would do, what any decent being should do when faced with a child in danger, or so he had believed. But as the years passed and Jonathan rose through the ranks of Earth's diplomatic corps, he had begun to understand something that troubled him deeply. Other species did not react the way humans did. The Volturians, with their great wings and sharp minds, would have calculated the odds and determined that saving the child was not worth the risk. The Mrethki, ancient and wise, would have debated the political implications until it was too late to act. Even the coalition, with all its resources and power, had sent only thoughts and prayers, while Valoria burned. Only the humans had acted. And only one human had been there to do so now, standing in the council chamber as ambassador of the United Earth government. Jonathan felt the weight of that realization pressing down on him. He had given his speech and acknowledged the assembly, and he was preparing to take his seat when he felt Ida gaze, intense and burning, fixed upon him from across the chamber. He turned and looked toward the Valorian section, and his heart stopped in his chest. She was there, the little girl he had carried through fire and death. Though she was not little anymore, she had grown into a stunning female, her scales shimmering with royal colors, her golden eyes as bright and beautiful as he remembered, and those eyes were fixed on him with an expression of absolute shock. He saw her gaze move to his arm, to the place where his sleeve had pulled back to reveal the old scar, and he watched understanding dawn in her face. She remembered, after 20 years, after all the pain and distance and time. She remembered the human who had saved her life. Jonathan felt his own eyes begin to water as emotions he had buried for decades came rushing to the surface. He had wondered so many times if she ever thought of him, if she remembered those 3 days, if he had been anything more than a blur in her memories of trauma and loss. Now he had his answer. She was shaking, he realized, her entire body trembling as she gripped the arms of her chair with claws that dug deep into the wood. The other delegates were watching with confusion, unable to understand why the powerful Princess of Valoria was reacting so strangely to the presence of a minor human diplomat. But Jonathan understood, and he knew that the moment he had been avoiding for 20 years had finally arrived. He stepped away from the central platform and walked toward the Valorian section, ignoring the whispers and stares of the assembled delegates. When he reached her seat, he stopped and looked down at the princess, at the woman she had become, at the child she had once been, and then he did something that no human had ever done before in the history of the Galactic Council. He bowed, deeply and respectfully, to an alien sovereign. "Your Highness," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You have grown." Princess Lyrithis Varkan stared at him for a long moment, her golden eyes swimming with tears that fell freely down her scaled cheeks. And then she spoke, a voice barely a whisper. "You were dead," she said. "I watched you die." Jonathan shook his head slowly and allowed himself a small, sad smile. "I thought I would die," he admitted. But the universe had other plans. The princess rose from her seat on unsteady legs, and the entire chamber fell silent as they watched this strange interaction between a minor human and one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. 20 cycles, she said, her voice growing stronger. "I have searched for you for 20 cycles. Jonathan did not know what to say to that, did not know how to respond to the knowledge that this incredible woman had spent 2 decades trying to find a simple cargo pilot from Earth. "I did not think he would remember me," he finally managed. The princess let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob, and she reached out to touch the scar on his arm with trembling claws. "Remember you?" she repeated, her voice breaking. "I have statues of you in my palace, poems written in your honor. A holiday celebrated in memory of the unnamed human who died saving the princess." Jonathan felt tears fall from his own eyes as he listened to her words. "I am not worth all that," he said quietly. The princess shook her head and took his hands in hers, holding them tightly as if afraid he might disappear. "You saved my life," she said. "You carried me through fire and gave me hope when I had none. You are worth everything." The council chamber had fallen into complete and utter chaos, as delegates from dozens of species whispered and shouted and demanded explanations for what they were witnessing. Princess Lyrithis Varkan, one of the most powerful sovereigns in the known galaxy, was standing before a human ambassador and holding his hands as if he were a long-lost family member. The Mrethki ambassador's tentacles coiled with confusion, and his translator device crackled as he tried to process what was happening. The Volturian representative's feathers ruffled with agitation, and she leaned forward in her perch to get a better view of the unprecedented scene. Even the Kithari observers, the monsters who had burned Valoria and killed millions, clicked and chattered among themselves with what might have been curiosity. The council speaker raised one of their ancient limbs and called for order, their voice echoing through the chamber with authority that demanded obedience. Princess Lyrithis, the speaker intoned, "This is highly irregular behavior for a diplomatic summit, and we request an explanation for this disruption." Lyrithis turned to face the speaker, and her golden eyes blazed with an intensity that made several nearby delegates shift uncomfortably in their seats. She released Jonathan's hands but remained standing beside him, her posture shifting from emotional vulnerability to royal authority in the span of a single breath. "You want an explanation?" she asked, her voice carrying to every corner of the massive chamber. "Then allow me to give you one." She stepped forward onto the central platform, the place where speakers addressed the assembly, and Jonathan watched her with a mixture of pride and concern. 20 cycles ago," she began, her voice steady and strong, "my world burned." The chamber fell silent as the weight of her words settled over the delegates like a heavy blanket. The Kithari collective descended upon Valoria Prime without warning or mercy, she continued, gesturing toward the chitinous observers who clicked nervously at the attention. "They killed my father in his throne room. They murdered my mother as she tried to flee. They slaughtered millions of innocent civilians for profit and sport." Her scales darkened with rage, but her voice remained controlled and measured. "And where was the coalition during this massacre?" she asked, turning her gaze upon the assembled representatives. "Where were our allies, our friends, our fellow members of this supposedly united galaxy?" Silence was her only answer. "You," she pointed at the Volturian representative. "Your species calculated the political implications of intervention and determined that the cost was too high." The Volturian's feathers flattened against her body in shame, but she did not speak. "You," she pointed at the Mrethki ambassador. "Your collective debated the ethical complications of interference until the debate became meaningless because there was no one left to save." The Mrethki's tentacles drooped and his translator hummed with something that might have been an apology. "And you," she pointed at the council speaker. "You send official communications expressing deep concern and profound sympathy. Words that did nothing to stop the killing or save a single life." The speaker remained silent, unable or unwilling to defend the council's inaction. "But there was one species that acted," Lyrithis continued. And now her voice softened as she turned to look at Jonathan. "One species that did not calculate the odds or debate the ethics or worry about political consequences." She walked back to where the human ambassador stood and placed her hand upon his shoulder. "This man," she said, "was a cargo pilot whose ship was caught in the crossfire and crashed on my world. A nobody from a backwater planet, a member of a species that had barely learned to travel between stars." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably under the gaze of hundreds of alien delegates, but he did not speak. When he pulled himself from the wreckage of his ship, he had two choices, Lyrithis explained. He could have hidden and waited for rescue, the sensible and logical thing to do. Or he could walk into a burning palace filled with armed raiders to save people he had never met and would probably never see again. She paused and let her words hang in the air. He chose to fight. He picked up a metal pipe and walked into hell because somewhere in that burning building, children were screaming and people were dying. He did not ask if it was wise. He did not calculate his chances of survival. He did not consider what he might gain from such reckless behavior. He simply acted because to humans, That is what you do when innocent people are in danger. The chamber remained utterly silent as the princess continued her story. He found me hiding beneath the bodies of my handmaidens, she said, a voice thick with emotion, a terrified child covered in blood and too scared to even cry. I scratched him when he reached for me. I left these scars on his arm. She touched Jonathan's forearm gently, but he did not flinch or pull away. He picked me up and carried me out of the palace, through the burning forests, for 3 days. He gave me his water when he had none for himself. He gave me his food when his stomach was empty. He wrapped me in his jacket when the nights grew cold, even though he shivered beside me. And when a Cathari patrol found us, when there was no way to escape, he told me to run and turned to face 6 armed raiders with nothing but a broken piece of metal. Larithis' voice cracked, but she forced herself to continue. I watched him fall, she whispered. I watched them cut him down and I thought he was dead. I mourned him for 20 cycles. She straightened and faced the assembly once more, but he did not die. He survived 80 months in a Cathari prison camp, enduring tortures that would have broken most beings. And he never once tried to contact me or claim any reward for his sacrifice. She turned to the human delegation and raised her voice. When I asked this man why he did it, why he risked everything for a child of another species on a world that was not his own, do you know what he said? She did not wait for an answer. He said he did what anyone would do, what any decent being should do when faced with a child in danger. Her golden eyes swept across the chamber, meeting the gazes of dozens of alien delegates. But we all know that is not true, she said, her voice sharp as a blade. We all know that no one else did what he did. The Voltorians calculated and the Mrethki debated, and the coalition sent thoughts and prayers. But only the human acted. She stepped forward and raised her hand toward the assembly. You wish to discuss humanity's integration into the coalition? She asked, and her voice was cold with contempt. You sit here in judgment of this species, debating whether they are worthy of a seat at your table? She laughed, a sharp and bitter sound that echoed through the chamber. You should not be asking if they are worthy of us, she declared. You should be asking if we are worthy of them. The delegates shifted and murmured among themselves, uncomfortable with the princess's words, but unable to refute them. Humans are not perfect, Larithis admitted. They are young and sometimes foolish. They are short-lived and often reckless. They make mistakes and stumble and fall. But when they see someone in need, they do not calculate the costs or debate the ethics. They act. They charge into burning buildings and fight impossible odds and sacrifice themselves for strangers. Not because it is logical or profitable, but because it is right. She turned to face the Cathari observers, and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. Your species burned my world and killed my family and tried to sell me into slavery, she said. And I have dreamed of destroying you every night for 20 cycles. The Cathari clicked nervously, and several of them rose as if preparing to flee. But this human, she gestured at Jonathan, this impossible, irrational, beautiful creature taught me something that my hatred almost made me forget. He taught me that the measure of a species is not their power or their technology or their territory. It is what they do when no one is watching, when there is nothing to gain, when the only reason to act is because it is the right thing to do. She returned to Jonathan's side and took his hand once more. I declared that the Valorian sovereignty will sponsor humanity's full membership in the coalition, she announced. And I will personally oppose any delegation that votes against them. The chamber erupted into noise as delegates shouted questions and objections, and demands for clarification, but Larithis ignored them all and looked at Jonathan with eyes that held 20 years of gratitude. I should have found you sooner, she said quietly. I should have searched harder. Jonathan shook his head and squeezed her hand gently. You had an empire to rebuild, he replied. And I am not worth the time of a princess. Lyrithis smiled sadly and shook her head. You still do not understand, she said. And perhaps you never will, to humans. Saving a stranger's life is ordinary. To the rest of us, it is extraordinary beyond measure. The vote had taken 3 days of heated debate and political maneuvering that would have exhausted even the most experienced diplomats in the galaxy species that had never agreed on anything, found themselves arguing passionately about the fate of humanity, some supporting the princess's call for full integration and others opposing it with equal fervor. The Kethari delegation had tried to block the proposal, citing concerns about human aggression and unpredictability. But their objections had been met with contempt from nearly every other species in the chamber. The monsters who had burned Valoria had no right to speak of aggression. And the irony of their complaints was not lost on anyone. In the end, the vote had been decisive, with over 80% of the coalition supporting humanity's full membership and all the rights and protections that came with it. Ambassador Jonathan Cole had watched the results with quiet disbelief, unable to fully accept that his simple act of courage 20 years ago had somehow changed the course of galactic history. When the speaker announced the final tally, the human delegation had erupted in celebration, their cheers echoing through the ancient chamber like thunder. But Jonathan had not joined in the celebration. He had simply stood quietly and watched Princess Lorethis Varkan across the chamber, meeting her golden eyes with his own and sharing a moment of understanding that required no words. She had done this, he knew. She had used her power and her influence and her story to give humanity a seat at the table of the stars, and she had done it for him. For the memory of 3 days in fire and death. For the cargo pilot who had refused to leave a child behind 3 days after the vote. Jonathan stood alone on the observation deck of the Grand Conclave Station and watched the stars wheel slowly past the massive windows. He had requested privacy, needing time to process everything that had happened, and everything that was about to change. Humanity would no longer be alone in the universe. No longer a minor species struggling on the edges of galactic civilization. They would be partners and allies with ancient powers, sharing technology and knowledge and the vast resources of a connected cosmos. It was more than he could have ever imagined. And yet it felt strangely hollow without someone to share it with. You should not be alone at a time like this, a voice said from behind him. And Jonathan turned to find Lyrithis approaching with her scales. Shimmering in the starlight, she had changed from her formal robes into simpler clothing that made her look more like the woman she was and less like the princess she had become. I could say the same about you, Jonathan replied with a small smile. You are the one who made all of this possible. Lyrithis shook her head and moved to stand beside him at the window. I only told the truth, she said. The rest was the result of your actions 20 years ago. They stood in silence for a long moment, watching the distant stars and the ships that moved between them like fireflies in the darkness. What happens now? Jonathan finally asked. Lyrithis turned to look at him, her golden eyes soft with an emotion he could not quite identify. The first human fleet will arrive tomorrow, she said. Dozens of ships carrying diplomats and scientists and explorers who will begin the work of integrating your species into the coalition. And after that? He pressed. After that, everything changes, she admitted. Humanity will have access to technologies that would have taken you centuries to develop on your own. You will have protection from predators like the Kethari. You will have a voice in the decisions that shape the future of the galaxy. Jonathan nodded slowly, trying to imagine what such changes would mean for his people. There will be challenges, Lyrithis continued. Some species will resent humanity's rapid rise. Others will try to exploit your inexperience. And there will be those who never accept that a young species deserves a seat at the table. but you will face those challenges the way you always have," she said with a smile. By charging forward and refusing to surrender, Jonathan laughed quietly and shook his head. "You make us sound like heroes," he said. "We are just people trying to do the right thing." "That is what makes you heroes," Lyrithis replied. "You do not see yourselves as special. You do not think your actions are remarkable. You simply act and then wonder why everyone else is impressed." She reached out and placed her clawed hand over his scarred forearm. "I spent 20 years searching for you," she said softly. "I commissioned statues and wrote poems and declared a day of mourning in honor of the unnamed human who died saving the princess. And now that I have found you, I realize that you have no idea what any of that means." Jonathan met her eyes and saw the tears forming there. "You think you did what anyone would do," she continued. "But the galaxy has shown us otherwise time and time again. The Voltorians would have calculated the odds and decided that saving one alien child was not worth the risk of death. The Mrethki would have debated the ethical implications until I was sold into slavery, or worse. Even my own people, the Valorians who should have protected me, fell to their fear and panic and could not save me. Only you acted. Jonathan Cole of Earth, only you walked into fire for a stranger." She moved closer to him, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The galaxy has grown old and tired," she said. "We have become so focused on survival and politics and the careful calculation of every risk that we have forgotten what it means to simply do the right thing. But humans remember. Humans have never forgotten. And perhaps that is why you are exactly what this galaxy needs." Jonathan did not know how to respond to such words, did not know how to accept praise for actions that had seemed so natural and necessary at the time. "I'm not a hero," he said quietly. "I was just a cargo pilot who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time." Lyrithis smiled sadly and shook her head. "You still do not understand," she said. "But that is precisely the point. Heroes never see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as ordinary people doing what must be done. That blindness, that inability to recognize your own extraordinary nature, is what makes you special." She turned back to the window and pointed at a cluster of lights that had appeared on the edge of the visible space. "There," she said. "The first wave of Earth's diplomatic fleet." Jonathan looked and saw the ships emerging from hyperspace. Dozens of vessels carrying his people toward a future they could never have imagined. "They are coming because of what you did," Lyrithis said. "Every human who will walk among the stars, every discovery they will make, every life they will touch and improve. All of it traces back to a cargo pilot who refused to leave a child behind." She took his hand in hers and squeezed gently. "That is your legacy, Jonathan Cole, whether you accept it or not." The human ships drew closer, and Jonathan watched them with eyes that finally began to understand the weight of what he had done. Not just for Lyrithis, not just for humanity, but for the galaxy itself. He had shown them something they had forgotten, something ancient and precious and desperately needed. He had shown them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. Had shown them that compassion was not weakness, but the greatest strength a being could possess. He had shown them that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe was not technology or military might or political influence. Sometimes it was simply a person who refused to stand by while others suffered. "Thank you," Lyrithis whispered as the first human ship docked with the station, "for not letting me die alone in that burning palace. Thank you for teaching me what it means to be truly brave." Jonathan squeezed her hand and watched his people arrive to claim their place among the stars. He did not know what the future would bring, did not know what challenges or triumphs awaited humanity in this vast and ancient galaxy. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever came next, humans would face it the way they always had, with courage, with compassion, and with the stubborn refusal to Abandon hope, even when logic demanded surrender, even when the odds were impossible, even when the universe itself seemed to stand against them, because that was what humans did. Somewhere in the vast and cold darkness between the stars, the galaxy began to warm one stubborn, impossible, beautiful human at a time. The end.